done. Well done. Evening all. Come on in. Come on in. Find a seat. Settle down now. Oh, it's my usual joke. It's I save it up for a Sunday. It's
you need a new one.
It's a captive audience. What can you do? It's evening all. Evening all. The usual faces. What a joy to see you all it is.
Steve Richards likes your jokes, apparently.
Quite right too. I pay him enough. I haven't got me chat window up. We'll do that in a minute. Oh, there we go. We'll do that in a minute. Very good. Very good. Right. How many have we got in the room at the minute, Grant?
No, you're up to 50.
50. Okay.
52.
Good. There's still a few more in the waiting room, so we'll just give it another minute or so. I was going to say, Dave Harvey, no guitar, but I can see that you're. Are you? You got that? There it is. There it is. Yeah. We're going to get you to play a tune one of these weeks. I promise you. I promise you. Oh, they're still coming in. Still a couple more coming in. Okay. In that case, then I think. Yeah, I think the last couple have now joined in. So in that case, then we will make a start as we've now just ticked over time. Okay, so good evening, everyone. Welcome to episode 7. Blimey, I can't believe how time just flies past. So here we are already at the end of June. You should all know me by now. So I'm Daz. I'm one of the admins here at Stargazers Lounge. And I'm obviously joined by Grant, our technical wizard. Grant will just make sure things are running smoothly in the background. And as usual, we are going to record the session, and that'll be posted up later. We haven't sorted out.
I was just about to say, apologies if anybody's waiting for us to post last week's, but it had so many musical clips in that YouTube had blocked it. So we haven't found a solution to that yet, but we'll post something up once we come up with a solution. The solution YouTube offered was to just take all the music out, which would have made it a slightly pointless talk.
Yeah, that was very good, considering that the whole point of the talk was indeed the music that goes with astronomy. But there we go. Okay, all right, we'll figure that one out, I'm sure. Okay, and as usual, obviously, we'll keep you on mute just so there's no noisy distractions. Okay, let's move on then. Oh yes, we were going to try this last week, but nobody actually had a question for Peter. So I'm sure there'll be some questions tonight. So we're gonna try this differently. We're going to let you loose on the microphone, and you can ask your question. Do send them in via the chat as normal. If you're not able to ask the question, just I've suggested put like a capital N or something on the end of it, just so that we can see that you're not able to ask, and we'll do it for you. Otherwise, we'll let you loose, and you can ask your own question. And as usual, any feedback and suggestions via the forums is always greatly appreciated. So, on to tonight's speaker then. Gary Palmer is a fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society. And like many of us images, he started off with some modest equipment, free software, and he taught himself the tools and the techniques to produce his outstanding images. Building on his skills, Gary got into solar imaging, if I've got that right, sometime in the early 2000s, and he has basically not stopped. Gary is now regarded as one of the very best solar imagers in the world today, but I can absolutely promise you his lunar images and deep sky images are pretty good too. His pictures are published regularly. He's an ambassador for Explore Scientific, and various manufacturers of astro equipment regularly consult with Gary on their prototypes. And in fact, just before we let you guys in, we were talking about that very subject and some of the issues that presents. Gary now works full-time in astronomy. He writes for various publications and magazines. He runs his own courses into teaching image processing, as well as how to get the most from your equipment, either remotely or I don't know if you remember those days, but he would actually come to your house and do that sort of thing. As you might expect, Gary is in high demand for his knowledge and his skills, so we are extremely lucky to have found a gap in his schedule. So, with what promises to be a really interesting talk, please welcome Gary Palmer. So, Gary, over to you.
Hi, thank you. Hi to everybody. What we're going to do is run our talk a little bit different from some others. We're not necessarily going to use our slideshows in a sense, and have a look at some different images of the equipment and wavelengths to start with, and then we'll move on through and get into some processing, which will be the key thing. So what we're going to do is start off with the wavelengths, yeah, looking at the different areas of the sun. So let me switch over my screen share. Let me drop these down for a second. There we go. Now you have to bear with me on this because I haven't used Zoom before, so I might get lost somewhere along the way. But what we're going to start with looking at, yeah, is the wavelengths. Now, we're quite fortunate these days that a lot of the equipment has changed in the last 5 years. Generally, we were looking at imaging in white light and hydrogen alpha. A few people were playing around in the calcium area, but we've had other equipment come along in the last few years. So we've now got sodium, we've got magnesium, and we've also got calcium H line. What we need to really do is look at the sun as a whole, and really where we are and what we're trying to capture or view. Yeah. So with white light, when we look at this band, we're really capturing as much as the camera can see, and the cameras have really changed a lot in the last few years as well. So in a white light image, it's sending in lots of information from different parts of the color spectrum, and that can make it quite hard, yeah, to use. So we can use things like solar continuum filters. They band it down a little fraction into the green area, but in general, it's still got quite a lot of other data coming in. And what we generally find is that that's the starting point. So people will use things like solar film or solar wedge, that sort of thing. When we're doing that, we're looking at the photosphere, so we're looking at the surface of the sun. Yeah, so we're looking at granulation and sunspots. Been generally quiet for the last 2 or 3 years, not a lot of sunspots around, and if there are, they've been very limited and very small. So what we find, people have moved on, they're moving into hydrogen alpha. That's now looking right up in the sun's atmosphere, in the chromosphere. And then in between, we've got these new wavelengths that are sort of popped along. If we look at calcium, calcium's blue, so it's in the cold area, and we can look at it that you're looking down at the surface of the sun. And as we get hotter, we're moving away, we're moving up into the sun's atmosphere. So the calcium's down in the blue area. We've now got magnesium, which is the new one, that's in the green area. We've got sodium, yeah, that's in there, just sort of bordering on the yellow to orange area. And then we move up into hydrogen alpha. You've also got helium. If you've got a second mortgage that you can afford the equipment for, I've only used it a couple of times out in the US, but the helium can show up quite a lot of detail as well. So what we're going to do is go in and have a look at a couple of these. So we'll look at the calcium. Calcium in general is quite hard to image from the UK, and one of the problems with that is our atmosphere. Yeah, so it creates lots and lots of problems. So if we look at a standard calcium mosaic, that's something like a 12-panel mosaic in calcium, and it's using one of the Lunt 150mm with their calcium module on the back. And we can see it shows up lots of granulation, shows up lots of active areas and the sunspots, and it's quite dark. But what you generally find with calcium is the problem that as we get older, we can't see it. Yeah, so when we look into the eyepiece, our eyes deteriorate, and if we've got any problems like cataracts or things like that, generally we can't see anything. And it can be quite dark, so you do still get some of the older calcium BST units around, and if you look into one of those, there's more or less nothing there. There's just this very, very dark violet blob in the middle. The newer system that's come out from Daystar is the H-line system. This is a lot more, a lot easier to use really at the end of the day. It's easier for us to see. We can see a lot more detail. You can see some prominences in calcium. There are few and far between at the moment, but when the sun gets more active, yeah, you will see them. But what we'll generally find is if we look at something like this and we start to go in close up in calcium, these are really, really hard images to get. There's something like probably once every 5 years that we could do something like this. And that's down to seeing conditions and getting the activity. That's the key thing. It's a combination. So when you're solar imaging, you generally find that you will never repeat that same object again. That's it. It's a dynamic object that we're imaging, and we will never see it again. But we also have to think about in some of these wavelengths what we're trying to do. So we've got the heat of our day, we've got our atmosphere, we've got the certainly a lot more high cloud over the last 4 to 5 years in the UK, and then we're on average 93 million miles off to the sun, and then to come down through the sun's atmosphere, through its chromosphere, we've got a reverse effect again. And we're trying to do all of that, and we're imaging on pretty average equipment. So this would have been on something like 150 millimeter refractor and using the H-line core. As I said, cameras have changed quite a lot these days. If we just come out of that, then we can see in this video trying to go high resolution, and that's not even getting in close. You can see how the atmosphere is causing it to wobble around quite a lot. So calcium is generally done at a lower resolution. It's done on something like an 80 millimeter, but changing the cameras now does work well with this. Using a smaller aperture and different camera sensors has a reverse effect. You can cut through the scene with a smaller aperture, and then the camera's pixels allow us to get in quite close to the object. If we start moving up from calcium, yeah, then we start moving up towards magnesium. Now, I haven't got a lot of high resolution images in magnesium, basically because we've only had it, yeah, for the last 2 years, and we've had the solar minimum. But this shows you really when you're using the magnesium unit, you're starting to pick up structures like the bottom of the chromosphere. So you're picking up connecting structures. And when we start to see more filaments, you're going to see the footprints for the filaments in calcium. Sorry, in magnesium. What it will also enable you to do is see the active areas. So you can see all of these active areas quite clearly. How well it will show flares when they go off, I can't answer that at the moment because it's still under, really, we're still sort of testing it in a way, but it is producing really good images. The only negative is to it, lots of people don't like the green sun. That's the key thing, but we'll move on to that in colouring later. But again, it brings out the sunspots quite clearly, and if you play around with it, you can get a lot of detail. I have seen quite a few different structural details that are not visible in the other wavelengths. So there are things there that you can't see at all in any other wavelength when we're doing comparison. It's a lot easier using magnesium to image through our atmosphere, so you generally get a lot more stable pictures out of it. And we also get really, I would say it's a mixture of detail. You're really looking at, I would probably say, nearly all of the wavelengths that we've got available at the moment. You're getting a bit of everything there. The only thing that you can't see in it, or not that I've seen yet, are prominences. You can't actually see any of those around the limb. So if we move up into sodium, sodium's up in the orange. It does give you really good granulation, sodium. They do say that you can see flare footprints with it. I've not actually seen them yet, even though I've had this when it's been quite active. Some people have said it's a bit of a damp squid compared to some of the other wavelengths, but again, it's very, very easy to image through poor conditions with. And when you're comparing it to white light, it does give you more detail there. If we start to look at that, the granulation on the surface, yeah, then we can really start to kick in. What I've generally found though is this last 4 years with our conditions going backwards, that has had a knock-on effect with solar imaging. So this using the larger equipment to get in close on stuff is proving quite hard. And again, that's a more basic one, but you can still see a lot of what's going on in there. As I said, around the same area as helium, we've only got one image of helium, and that was done in really poor conditions in the US. Again, I'm not sure whether I really like it. I'm not sure whether I would actually spend that sort of money, even with the amount of solar work that I do. I think the other magnesium at the moment is the one really, apart from hydrogen alpha, that I would lean towards. And then we start moving up. We move up into hydrogen alpha. These are the sort of standard shots, standard dish shot that we would get out of something like a Lunt 60, 100mm, something like that. If I remember rightly, this was done on a 60mm Lunt double stack when we had one at IAS show a couple of years back. This would be off of the 60mm Daystar unit. Yeah, that's an image off of their double stacks unit. Again, very quiet, so but you can still pick up the prominences and you can still see what's going on, yeah, in the active areas. Prominences are really what lots of people are after. They're after this sort of thing. That's where the hydrogen alpha units kick in. But you do have quite a few different bandings. So you have Armstrong levels on these units, and generally the cheaper units will run at somewhere around 0.7 Armstrong. When we got 0.7 Armstrong, it's very, very good at picking up prominences, but it's not so great for picking up great detail in the active areas. We start moving down to, say, 0.5 Armstrong. Equipment starts to get more expensive. It's generally double stacked. And what we mean by double stack is putting another filter on the system somewhere. So on the Lunt systems, it will generally be on the back with the larger systems, or the Coronado and the smaller Lunts will have a double stack filter that will sit on the front of the telescope. And that narrows the band, so it's narrowing it down to that 0.5 Armstrong. When you start going a bit more specialized on that, then we start looking at units like the one that I use. That's about 0.2 Armstrong. So that has a totally different effect in the way that we view the sun, and it allows me to do lots of different things. One of the key things that it allows me to do is to actually come through the chromosphere. So I can adjust and play around with the settings on it, and I can either sit right back and look on the outside of the sun, so it's really good for things like filaments, or I can come right the way through the chromosphere and I can start looking at the photosphere, but I'm in hydrogen alpha, and that really shows up any of the active areas, any of the flare points and different things like that. Again, another prominence, you can see the conditions there. So a good key thing to show you poor conditions with solar imaging is how flat the surface is. So it almost looks like it's got a coating over it, and that is our high cloud. That's our atmosphere causing that problem. But generally, you can still pick off quite good detail in the prominence itself. you get used to imaging in the UK and the conditions, and therefore you just take what you can get. Yeah, clouds come along and you just sort of run for the gaps in between. This would be sunspot in HA, and we're really running into the sun here. We're running in at a focal length of about 8 meters, yeah, into the sun. So using quite a few different techniques. Same again, something like 150 mil aperture, and then we'd be using quite a few different Barlows at different stages. And if you get used to playing around with these sorts of things, you can get the spacing correct on these, and then not get any bright points in the image. And what I mean by bright points is you can get like a bright circle here, and that's normally a reflection off of one of the Barlows in the system, or it can be a reflection off of the telescope. One of the problems really when we look at something like a Coronado or a Lunt, they all generally have followed the same path of design. And the blocking filters and the etalons in them are very, very similar in the way that they work. And that means we can get off-axis light. So, not that I've got any on here, because I hate off-axis light in my pictures. Yeah, it's one of the real bugbears of a solar imager. But what you can generally find is if we're imaging this prominence, you can find a really bright area or a cone effect coming in off of the system. And there are a few ways that you can play around with this and remove this, but in general, flat subtractions and all of those other things don't work, because once that cone's in there, it's removing detail, and you can't replace what's removed. So normally it's around them playing with the cameras and maybe reducing the amount of magnification that we're using. If we look at one of the videos, this would be a standard video. And that's a Hdr now for video. So you can see parts of the active area there. You can see how it's coming and going with the seeing conditions. A lot of people, if you go to the US, will look at that and go, I wouldn't even bother imaging on a day like that. We don't have that luxury. Yeah, and you'd be surprised what you can get out of these videos, even when they look quite poor. Our white light, just so we've covered it, these are general white light video, something like that. So you can see the atmosphere will affect this a lot more. Yeah, and it's why people don't generally go for high resolution white light in the UK, or really anywhere north of about somewhere around 45 degrees up. Yeah, it starts to get quite awkward to do. But if you persevere, you can get some reasonable images out of it. And it's just a case of playing around, and you're going to find that these magnifications, you will get some noise in there. That's just par for the course, really, of doing it. Looking at some of the objects, I want to run through these because whenever I post an image, it might be a prominence and somebody go, oh, that's a fantastic flare. It's not a solar flare. Yeah, all of these things have different names. So we'll look at something like a CME. CME is generally caused by something like this filament. So we look at the filament here. This image I did must be about 7 years ago now. I think it was 2012, something like that. Anyway, it hadn't been done on standard Coronado equipment or standard telescopes, this sort of imaging. So it was my path to turning things into three-dimensional. I was looking at solar images and thinking they all look very similar. They're not really standing out at you. But these filaments here, they at some point generally break off from the sun. And as they break off, if they've got good momentum, they just disappear. Nothing's ever seen of them again, and that's it. But quite often we get one of these, it will start to break off from the sun, and as it moves out, it's not got enough momentum. So therefore, it starts to collapse back in. Now you've got to think that all the magnetic structures that are going on there around that area at the time you can have all sorts of issues then. And as this comes down, it basically creates a mass explosion, a coronal mass ejection. So it just stirs everything up. And this actually led to one of the most famous NASA images, which you see everywhere. That was what came off of it and what NASA saw. Unfortunately, I tracked it for about 3 days, and as soon as it got dark, it decided to explode and go out into a CME. So we missed that one, which was really disappointing, but that's the way it goes. You can look at this here. Now, there's good telltale things when you see a prominence. This sat here for a couple of hours, but you could see every now and then it kept lifting like this. And we had the cloud coming and going, and we could just see these, really there's attaching points at the back here. And that normally tells you that something's about to occur. You know, you can, over years, you can just tell what's going to occur. And within minutes, it turned into that. So we're literally then working out that we're running into the sun for that last image, again at about 6 or 7 meters, and it's like claps everything down and change it over for smaller apertures to try and get it in, because it's still growing as it's going through. In the head here is the CME, that's the actual point. And then when we finally got the equipment changed over, that was how far it was coming off the sun, and it was still going. It still went to the point where we couldn't get it anymore. But that is a coronal mass ejection. They have a lot of effects on us here. So we certainly get radio blackout, we get problems with satellites, and we can get problems with power here on Earth. There will also be lots of other things as we move forwards in the future. I mean, these are going to affect us in different ways. We're moving to a more electronic society these days, so I suspect that a lot more things that rely on GPS and Ellen's satellite systems that are going to run around giving us internet when we get 10 years down the road, and we're relying on those. I can see us getting internet dropout here and there through all of these things. Filaments on the sun. As we said, that was that one there. So you can see the 2 different cameras there. Use 2 different cameras on it. Left-hand image, was done with the Luminera Skynex camera, and the right-hand image was done with the DMK31. And you can see why the Luminera camera was a lot more money at the time. I've always had a fascination with filaments. They're my one thing I like on the sun. I like to get in and look around the feet and how they're connecting, and lots of other things, and also to see whether we can look through the top of them. This is really what gives it a 3-dimensional look, or a view, really, at the end of the day. One of my early 3D images again, this was again working on different systems. When Daystar launched the Quark, really just looking at it, I'd already worked out that we could double stack that. So I designed a double stack system for it, and then the Quark landed and did 2 or 3 images with the actual Quark itself, and then put it into a double stack system. And this was some of the first images that came out of this. That was one of the next images that came out from the double stack system, and nobody had ever done anything like this or seen anything like it. The problem with the conventional design, like I said with London Coronado, they put so many pieces of glass in there, it ends up really, really dark. So you then have to start running the camera at almost a second exposure to do something like this. And to record second exposures into video is really, really hard. The system that I worked on was to produce more light, basically, through the imaging train. And that allows us then really to only run at, say, 20% more than what we would use for a standard, 20% more exposure than what we would use for a standard system. Something like that, that's a 12-panel mosaic, one of the larger filaments a few years back. And again, it's just playing around with these and seeing what we can get. These are the sort of filaments that I really like. They're the things that really get me interested and spend hours and hours trying to capture these. But a filament, just so we know, when it's on the surface, that's where it's named as a filament. When it gets to the limb of the sun, it's a prominence. So if it's on the left-hand side, basically it's going to rotate towards us, and it's going to sit there for however many days it wants to. Some of them get full pass of the sun. You're looking about 13 days rotation on the sun. So from this point here, from it coming over the limb to it exiting on the other side of the sun. Okay, prominences come in all sorts of variations. One thing that's really hard from the UK to do is to put these into videos, really, and that's because of, again, with the seeing conditions. You can do it on smaller aperture, but when you're coming in close to some of these, it's very, very hard. But again, as I said, if it's on this limb edge, it's classed as a filament. You'll hear another term maybe called a filaprom, yeah, and that's really where the filament's there and the prominence comes out. So it's really joining across the edge of, on the surface there. Again, these are just some older ones that I've put together, and they've done all sorts of different equipment at different times. This was the end of that CME. This is what it turned into. So that's roughly how far out it went on the sun. And I had to stop imaging there because of weather. But really at that point there, it's more a prominence than the CME's gone out of it, the energy's gone out of it. But some of these can run out to 250,000 miles quite easily from the sun. So there's lots of different shapes and variations and names for them. Solar flares, this is what NASA sees when we look at it. So that there is an X9 solar flare. They were in September 2017, I think they were. We had a whole 2 areas rotation. They did 2 full rotations, these areas, and probably the largest sunspots of the last solar cycle. They were certainly the largest of the last decade anyway. One thing that I started getting into was looking at some of these images and looking at images that I was taking and working out that every time a solar flare goes off, it overexposes the camera. So me being nosy, I want to know where the solar flare is coming from. Yeah, not really seeing where it exits the chromosphere of the sun. So I set about with the 0.2 Armstrong and working with some different things and coming up with some different ideas. And this would be a standard view of that flare that I would see. Normally using standard equipment, it would be something like this. So again, it's all overexposed now. The easiest way to explain this is if we had a bathtub above us leaking, the water very rarely comes out directly below where it's leaking. It works its path through the ceiling and comes out somewhere totally different. And this is very similar when the flare comes through the chromosphere. It comes through at all different places. So therefore, I don't actually know where that's come from. Now we didn't have magnesium then. Magnesium would probably show it up to quite a precise location. But I decided to play around and then work out exactly where it was coming from, and that's there. So by switching the hydrogen alpha system and by band shifting it, we can peel away the chromosphere. So basically you're just taking away the chromosphere layer, and then you can look down and you can see all of the footprints of the sunspots, and you can see the solar flare, yeah, exactly where it exited, without overexposing the camera, which is the key thing. That's a bit more of a contrasty one. You can see there, that is the exact point where it came out, and you had another point just the other side of the loop. Again, these sort of images, they've not been done, they've not been repeated because we've not had the activity on the sun. So these are all sitting there in hibernation at the moment, waiting for the sun to get active again, and then we'll kick off on these. But they're a solar flare. they're very, very quick. The average is about 20 minutes, yeah, from start to finish. And you'll get the peak point somewhere in between that. And then it'll get measured. Your general measurements on these are C, M, and X. There are other classes there, but the most common measurements we see. C class, they're pretty low. M class can be sort of medium range in a sense, and then your X class, which is the top of the tree. The largest one of these that's been captured on camera actually came off the edge of the sun, and that was around X20, although there's a lot of different thoughts on to how powerful it was. But to give you an idea, if an X20 flare blew off the sun directly towards us, you could expect some severe disruption on all sorts of systems. Hasn't been anything like that for a long, long time. Come down to Earth. Sunspots. There you go. Hdr and alpha sunspot. Going 2 or 3 years ago, something like that. They vary, they change shape. Depending on this system here, is using either a double stack or it's the quantum, it's quite dark. So you won't necessarily see all of the light bridging structures that come across when imaging like this. And there's a more wide field view, yeah, of a couple of sunspots. It's really down to each person as to what they like to image. Every person likes their own thing. It's no different when we do deep sky or, you know, when we're doing lunar imaging. Some people like close-up of craters, and some people like a full disk image. So everybody's really slightly different with this. Some of the equipment, quick look at some of this. Different cameras, yeah. This is the Daystar 60mm Solar Scout, 174 camera on there. And then this would be the quantum standard quartz system, 60mm again. And this piece of equipment here is quite important. I will discuss subtracting flats in a little bit, but the biggest problem imaging with Hdr and alpha is Newton's rings. Yeah, so we get problems with the rings or patterning in the actual image. And that is caused by the light coming through. Basically, it's coming all the way down the telescope, comes straight through the solar filter, and then it hits the sensor. And as it hits the sensor, because the sensor's dead parallel, yeah, with the solar filter, it bounces back, and then we get off-axis light bouncing back onto the sensor. So we end up with this all really starting to move around, and then it creates wavy patterns, circular patterns, all sorts of problems in the images. These are quite expensive, I will say that. I've come up with other ways in the past, yeah, of doing this, but basically what you have to do is introduce some form of tilt to the camera. And if you don't tilt the camera, then you will get these, even if you're subtracting live flats, you will still get the ringing patterns or the banding patterns in the image. So this is Daystar's interference eliminator. It does replace the PVC tape and the other things that we used to have in the old days that were tilting the camera over and stopping it falling out. We would use any way of getting some form of tilt on the camera. I even, before I've cut adapters, yeah, and put an angle on them, yeah, so that when they go in, they tilt over very slightly. But if your fitting there is very, very tight, which it is on some solar telescopes, you can't get the camera to lean naturally. So you have to pull the camera back very slightly so it can get some tilt on it. Problem is if you're imaging like this, directly straight up in midsummer, your camera's going to try falling on the floor every 5 seconds. So you have to come up. We used to wrap the cables around all sorts of things and tape and everything we could. But they're quite an important part of imaging these days. Other equipment I've used, like I said, the Lump 150. This was actually my first solar setup. This was my first rig, PST and a white light filter on the CPC. And color camera on there. You know, no different to anybody else. Most other people have tried lots of these different things. 90mm Coronado, I had that for a long time. That was one of my main imaging scopes for years. Produced a lot of the images that you see. This is one of the main units I use now, the Quantum. Daystar sent this over, and I've been doing all sorts of different things on it. It's quite a rare unit. It's not a off-the-shelf unit. It runs at 0.2 amp strong, and they're probably somewhere, I would say, around $35,000 these days for something in that area. I think the 0.3 amp strong is around the $28,000, something like that. This running at 0.2. But by using this, we've been able to do those things that I was showing on the solar flares. Off-axis, LX200 12-inch, you know, all sorts of equipment, and coming up with different ideas and playing around over the course of time. And that's the current range of corks at the moment. So got the Hdr now for red one, H-line calcium, magnesium, sodium, and we've also got our UV-IR cut filter. Now, there are a few different things with this. If we look at something like let's say the Solarmax 60 or some of these other telescopes, they don't necessarily use a UV-IR cut filter for energy rejection. They don't need to, but we still need to use one somewhere in the imaging train for the camera, because using a mono camera, it's going to open us right up to stuff coming in the IR band. And these cameras are getting more and more sensitive now to low band IR. So when I first, I looked into doing low band IR imaging, and something like the DMK camera would cut off around 710 nanometers. And it was quite a push, it was quite a steep cutoff around that 700 to 710 nanometers. A lot of the cameras now are pushing right up into the 760 and 780 nanometers before they even start to cut off. So they are used. 125 version, I generally use a 2-inch version, and depending on what way I have the cork mounted, I generally mount the cork back, out the back of the equipment, like what was shown in here. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Not necessarily on this 60mm, but certainly when we're using larger aperture telescopes. The telescope's shielding the camera. So that way, as we're looking up at the sun, the camera's getting some protection of heat. If you look at the sensors these days with the temperature readout, some of these are cooking themselves away at 38 degrees in the sun when we're using a diagonal and coming off the top. So I generally always image like this on any of the systems. If you've got a second house that you want to sell, this unit is Daystar's electric filter wheel, which you can have loaded up with all sorts of goodies from all of their range of filters and all different wavelengths and areas. Probably somewhere around $50,000 to $60,000 these days, the time it's fully loaded with the filters. I do keep trying to get one in my luggage whenever I come back, but I've not quite worked that far. So, looking at capturing the images, I generally use sharp cap. You can use fire capture or really whatever your camera works in. I've done a few bits here or there, but in general, if we look, I actually took these in the week just that we had some of these here, and I am setting this up so that we're going to take a live flat. So what we would do is get the system all in focus, put up our histogram, and I set it at around 50 on the histogram. Then what we need to do is, if we go up to the top in sharp cap in the capture area and shoot down to the bottom where it says capture flats, and we're going to subtract live flats from the videos. Yeah, and I do this all the time. So once you click on that, capture the flat frame, it'll come up with this. And then all you're going to do is adjust your exposure, to bring your histogram to around the 50 mark there. Then what you do is just defocus. So you point the telescope at the center of the sun. Yeah, defocus it. Yeah, and press start, and that's it. It's captured the flats and it's subtracting them. And then we just refocus back up again. These are single shots, so the clarity there is not that clear. If you actually see the videos that have come in through, it's not overly bad. The settings on the prominences is very, very hard. Yeah, because the camera and the software is always going to read the white point on the overexposed surface. So what I always say on this is just make sure that you can visibly see on the screen the chromosphere line running across there. If you overexpose this anymore, you lose the chromosphere line, and in that area there is where you're going to pick up all your spicules, that are running through, and the base to any of the prominences. If we look at the actual videos, I generally capture in SER. The reason for SER, certainly on solar, is because the video's file size. So if we capture in AVI, there's a couple of issues with it. One, if we get roughly over 3.5 gigabyte, Windows has a meltdown and can't recognize the file. It also can't move it from hard drives, once it gets into this problem. And the other thing is depending on the software, there's so many codecs for AVI. And you get into all sorts of problems where one piece of software will stack it and another piece won't, and so on. So it's just as easy to set these all up to record in SER. The length of the videos, it really depends on what camera I'm using, but I generally record somewhere around 1,000 frames. I don't go much over that. Sometimes if there's something really interesting there and it's nice and stable, I'll record a couple of 1,000 frames. But you don't really need to do much more. So if we look at the video, something like that one there, yeah, it's nice and stable. You can see the odd bright points coming through there. Yeah, and it'd be quite a good video to run through the process. If we're looking at the prominence image, you can see there that the chromosphere line, is there right the way through. So that's giving you good exposure. You can adjust your black points or your brightness level on the cameras. You can nip those up a little fraction in the capture software. It's quite easy to do that. And that might show up some of the fainter stuff around the background here. Again, it depends on what wave or what Armstrong you are in hydrogen alpha as to how much fine detail you're going to see out the back here. 0.7 Armstrong, you're going to see lots of detail going on out the back here. Once we come down to 0.5, it's going to tighten up a little bit more around the main object. And also, again, aperture. Closer you get into these objects, then the more issues that you're going to get with the videos. So we're going to process one of them up. We'll drop in that one for the minute. Now, you have got Auto Stacker 3 out. I don't like it. I'll be dead straight and honest. It's had problems from the beginning, and this goes back to the early versions of Auto Stacker. And that is that in its logarithm, it attaches onto high cloud moving through. And as the high cloud moves through the image, it locks onto that and actually sees it as part of our video, really, at the end of the day. And it creates all sorts of problems. So if you're imaging prominences, you can get all staggered edging, or you can get other problems. This version, Auto Stacker 2.7.7, is the one that I've been using for ages. Never get any problems with it, and it's nice and straightforward. Once you've dropped your video into this, first thing to click on is Improve Tracking. and also that it's a surface. If we switch it into planetary, you're going to notice it's going to crop all the edges off, and it's going to create all sorts of problems in the way that it looks at the image. The other thing is to expand the image. Yeah, I'm not worried about the crop lines on the edge. I want to make my decision as to where I crop the image, and not a piece of software deciding where it thinks the best place is. There might be something that I'm looking at that I want that's right near the edge, or if I'm mosaicing, so I prefer to crop them myself. Looking at the noise robust area, generally have it up around 6 or 7. Yeah, there is quite large detail that we're looking at in the image. And then looking at the alignment points, yeah, on a global frame, so they're going to go across the whole frame. So if we get our control and our mouse key, we're going to click over this actual one of the sunspots there. You can change the sizing on this. This size generally works for most videos. And then we're going to click on the top there and just adjust the mouse wheel until we find a frame like that one there that's just a little bit sharper than all of the others. So as you're running through, you can go right the way through the video. I can tell just by looking at that we're going to get some quite nice data out of just running through there. And then we hit analyze. While that's running through, I've already got Registax set up in the background there, ready to take the new image. Now, if you use more file options, you can send the image straight over to Registax to adjust the wavelets on. You can use PixInsight. There's many other programs now that I use for wavelets, but if you want to keep it simple, Registax is still the easiest one to do the wavelets on. Okay, now the seeing monitor here, chuck it in the bin. Yeah, it makes no difference to any of your images. We get so much fluctuating cloud that it sees those bright points when the cloud disappears. So it's going to put those as a higher grade here on the quality graph. It makes no real difference. I've imaged these where they've been right across the bottom here and still had some fairly good images out of them. But people spend too much time in this area, and it's really not needed. That's the easiest thing. So once we're happy here on this sort of image, I'd use 104 for the alignment point size, and then just tell it to automatically place them on the grid. Now, if you're doing prominences, you want to adjust your minimum brightness level. I just keep it at 5 for everything, but generally when you install the program, I think it's up at about 35. So it will shape right around a prominence, and you might not want the alignment points that tight if there's some fine stuff going on in the background. The amount of frames, we've recorded 1,000. We're going to stack 200, yeah, for this image, and just hit stack. Faster your computer is, faster it processes. It's that pretty much that straightforward. Okay, so if we open up Registax, that's the image popping in. I'm going to reset these here. Okay, so depending on how close you're imaging to the sun, if we're imaging on something like a BST, this initial layer here is quite important. Yeah, it's very, very easy to overcook one of these images. Yeah, and this is the point where you overcook it, and it looks over-processed then. And we're trying to keep fine detail in whatever we're doing. So if I was imaging on a PST, I'd have this at initial layer 1. If I'm imaging on 150 mil and I've got loads of Barlows and quite a tight camera, then I'd probably have this up at initial layer 4. Yeah, and your easiest thing is just to play with it. So I'm going to take a stab at this image and go initial layer 2, and then we're just going to use linear, yeah, and default, and we're only going to use number 2 slider. We're just going to drag it halfway and see what we get. That's too much. Yeah, so we're going to drop it back. Go back to about a third, somewhere around there, and then click do all. even that is a little bit too much there. I might be inclined just to come back a little touch more. I would prefer not to get too much noise in this and not to get the objects in there, like this filament, too bulky. Yeah, if we now start clicking up the initial layer, you'll see what it does to the image. And you can see why you think you're getting more detail in here. You're actually stiffening up all of the structures. And when you go to process this or add color in Photoshop, then you're going to get all sorts of problems. So keeping the initial layer down to start with, and then we go do all there. And that I would be quite happy with. I would save it at that point and then be sending it straight into to Photoshop. So we'll have a look at one of the other images there. That one. Yeah, so we're just going to do exactly the same thing. Drag and drop. Now this one's a lot closer. So a little bit more care when you're choosing your frame as you're running through. You might also choose to stack less frames. If you've got quite an unstable image, stacking less frames will help stabilize your final result. So I might stack, say, 100 frames or 50 frames. Certainly if I was in white light, less images into in the stack give you a better result. So all we're going to do is look for the data in the sunspot. So we're going to try and look for the legs that are in there to stabilize themselves. So somewhere around there, and just have a look somewhere else. Yeah, so we've got two the same now. Same settings as before. And again, 1,000 frames recorded, so stack somewhere around 200 on this. They're quite large files, some of these, when they're coming in on the cameras now. You can be running at anywhere between 3.5 and 5 GB of data, which for a video file to process is quite a lot of data. Okay, so same thing again, 104, place them on there and stack. Okay, so you'll see our initial layer, and that was one of the reasons why I chose this, is going to need a lot more for this image because it's a lot closer to the sun. So depending on your focal length and what you're trying to do, yeah, this is where you really need to play around with the images. And on this particular one, I probably would have gone 100 if I was keeping this. Looking at the data that I'm getting there, it's a little bit softer. You can see some of the detail here, but you can also tell that the sunspots are quite close to the limb. And when you get the sunspots quite close to the limb, and we can tell that because this area is quite dark over here, you get the Wilson effect, which is basically the image is looking very, very slightly crushed on one side. You don't get that nice fine detail that you would when the sunspots are in the center. So look, let me just play with one of these. Yeah, just do this as the last one, and then we're going to add some color to this one. So same thing again, except for this video is going to be slightly sharper. There's lots of different software out there that you can use for coloring. It doesn't have to be Photoshop. It's just that I have Photoshop because I use it for the other imaging and the other processing. You've got GIMP. You've got all sorts of different software out there now that all work very, very similar. One of the things at this point that's worth reminding people of is the actual screen calibration. Yeah. If we have our screen too bright, then our images, when we post them up, are too dark. And if we have our monitor too dark, then the images go up, they're too bright. If you've got a laptop, it's a good idea to set the brightness on it to somewhere around 1/3. Generally, laptops seem a lot brighter than a standard computer monitor. But it's quite a common thing. So people go to do all of this work, and you find that when they're doing all of this work, their end result is quite poor, and most of it is through screen calibration. And this is also the same on deep sky. I look at quite a lot of deep sky images that are posted, and you think there's some fantastic detail there, but you just need to adjust your screen calibration. And it seems pretty pointless. Now, I do actually use a spider unit myself. Yeah, I use that to calibrate all of the monitors, and then hopefully, mind you, do make mistakes. I posted an image at about 3 o'clock in the morning the other week. Yeah, looked at it first thing in the morning and went, wow, that's junk. Yeah, the screen calibration had gone off, and that was it. So we put this into full image now. This one here, yeah, somewhere around 3, and we're just going to pick it up a little touch there. There we go. There we go. So, what's unusual about the image? It's another one that I was working on, and it ties in with what we were doing with the solar flares. If you look at these points here, they're very, very similar to element bombs. That's more consistent with an element bomb shape there, slightly oval. But you can see these are tracking up the rips, so they're following a path. Now, didn't really see them on the screen. They were sort of there, but again, in the seeing conditions, you're not really looking for them. I'm more looking for the structural detail around the sunspot. Processed them afterwards and found these were in there. And it was at the end of the day where we had, I think, one more video afterwards. So we couldn't actually work out what direction they're tracking, whether they're tracking in different directions, but they were very, very symmetrical. Image was sent in. If I got issues, I send mine into Goddard. Yeah, and they have approves over them and then come back that they know what it is, or they don't know what it is. And on this, it's got everybody stumped at the moment because nobody knows what it is. So we need the same sort of thing where we get 2 sunspots at this distance apart, and we've got the rib system, which is quite common. So hopefully we can see this again. So we've got them in the folder. There, and then we're going to open that in Photoshop. Now you saw my Photoshop there asked me whether I want to assign a color to it. I have mine set for Adobe RGB 1998. That's for all imaging. That means when I print it out, when I send it off to a magazine, whatever happens with it, I know that the color is correct in the image and it's going to match on all of the systems. If you don't set your colouring up, then that's the reason why when you go to print these out, you think, oh, they look really, really good. I'd like one of those printed out, and you waste all your printer ink because nothing looks as good as what it does on the screen. Yeah, it's calibrating the printer as well, really. So I'm going to crop the lines off of the edge. There's a couple of things you can do with the image. First thing I would do is switch it into grayscale. Yeah, and have a look. We might be able to run a HDR. Now, this was more a scientific image. Having those things in there then turns it slightly different from our normal artistic image. Yeah, so I'd be tending not to mess around with this image too much. But if it was a normal image, then I'd run it into HDR toning. And then we would have a play around in here. Now you can also see the natural effect here of where it's slightly bright at the top and slightly dark at the bottom. We can correct that. That isn't necessarily an issue. What we're looking at is anything like here. We can bring that back in by dropping the highlights back. Yeah, and that bring the white down very, very slightly in there. So if you've got a big active area, slightly overexposed, you can use this to grab some detail back. I generally drop the details off. This is a sharpening thing that's in here, but you can play around with this. You can do all sorts of effects in here and turn it more three-dimensional if you want. All of that stuff's available in there. On this particular one, like I say, I wouldn't necessarily do that. If I wanted to colour the image, we go into mode at the top. Once we're in grayscale, switch it to 8-bit, and then go in and go duotone. Yeah, I've got my two colours set there, yeah, that I use for this. So all we're going to do is just brighten it very slightly with the levels. Just going to give it a little pep up. And then we're going to go into colour balance. Flip it back into an RGB image and go colour balance, and we can adjust the colours. So really, whatever our personal taste is, we can play around with this to our heart's content, really. And then use a legacy contrast on it, and that will just bring out a deeper red. I can see a little bit of patterning on that, and that will be where we're in quite close. So if we run a despeckle, that will just clear any patterning. It will clear any overload from the wavelets off. And then if we want to sharpen it, we can sharpen it in whatever way we want. It's really down to us. I can use something like unsharp mask. Yeah, and then I can play around in here. Probably on an image like this, you want it up at somewhere around 3.4, and then run that up to about 90%, somewhere around there. Depending on the sensors as well, how you rotate the image around. It's really how it's displayed. Yeah, some of these images, when you put them up onto social media and on the forums, they can look really too big. So it's quite often an idea just to rotate the image around. Yeah, missed that one. Something like that. Now, if we go back a couple of steps, I'm just going to move that slightly, and I want to move that there just so I can see it. If we go back to when this was grayscale, and we looked at this side, we could really see what was going on. Yeah. With the image being darker and lighter on one side. So if we go back up here, now we can really see it. We can see what's going on there. You can, we'll just move this back very slightly. So I've got a couple of, let's get that in there to fit. Let's move this around. Okay, if we go to the channels, yeah, we're going to add a channel here. And we want it at 1%, yeah, opacity on there, and then we're going to make it active. Okay, and if we get color sampler, press the shift button, one there, and then we're going to use the gradient tool. I'm going to run the gradient across. There we go. And then when these things get out of the way, there we go, load selection. We're going to load that in as a selection now. And you'll see that it's masked off half the image. We go back and now under the channels, select on the RGB image and go into levels. Just use the central slider and you can just balance the image up very slightly without affecting the rest of the image. This is quite natural. A lot of people think some of the filters are off band, there's problems with quarks, there's, you know, all of these different things. What you have to look at is when we look at the sun, if we look at it dead center, yeah, and then we took a measurement back to each limb on either side, it would work out that we're roughly around 500,000 miles closer at the center of the sun. So therefore, the image, when we're taking an image from the left of center, it's always going to be brighter on the right of the image. And if we're right of center, it's always going to be brighter on the left, because that left point is closer to us. So quite a lot of images will need something like this to balance them back up again. You might have got something like the interference eliminator. If you get it on a 174 sensor, the sensor's quite wide, and you might find that you've just got it tilted a little bit too far, so it's creating that sort of problem. But anyway, that's one of the easiest ways to correct it. If you wanted the other side lighter, let me just do that first. Then we could just go inverse, flip it over, and then you could go back through the process, yeah, and just adjust that if you wanted to make it a touch lighter, so you get a better balance on the image. Yeah, you can split this around. You can run a gradient mask to the corner. So if you get just one corner out, yeah, then you can run your gradient mask over and put your two markers there. There's all sorts of things that you can do on playing around with this. Really, that's about it. Yeah, so I don't know whether you've got any questions lining up on things.
We have indeed, Gary. That's amazing. Thanks. Thanks very much indeed. $35,000 for the.
Yeah.
Well, yes, I can see why you perhaps want to save up and quite considerably for that one, but which I have to say goes with the title of one of the best solar images in the world. I think they give these bits of kit to just anybody. So
Yeah.
amazing. Okay, looking at the questions board, we do indeed have some questions coming in. So, Mr. Steve Richards, if you've now finished that delicious 3-course dinner that your wife has no doubt spent all day slaving over a hot stove for you, I will unmute you if I can find you, and you can ask your question. Unmute.
Indeed. I obviously missed a point somewhere at the beginning. I wonder if you could just expand on it slightly. You mentioned X19 and X20 on a couple of times. I have no idea whether they're some kind of magnitude.
Or a magnitude.
Or what? They're sorry, go again.
They're a magnitude. They're
a magnitude.
They're really a power. Yeah. So the X class is the more powerful out of all of them. C class are really more like a disturbance, if you understand what I mean by that. So they're very small. They're just disturbances. They're not going to really affect anything on Earth. Even a larger C class, very, very doubt whether it would cause any radio blackout, but it would just cause a small bright white point where it ejects from the sun. M class, they can have some effect on radio blackout, certainly on the larger ones. And your X class, then they move on to really categorizing a disruption on Earth. But that depends on where the flare comes from. So if it was off to the limb, it was off to one side, we might just see a little bit of radio interference or radio blackout. If it's directly facing us, then yes, then we could get all sorts of problems. If we go back to the largest one on record, which was the Carrington event, we had nothing electronic. Then the only thing was the telegraph, which had just been invented, and it took all the telegraphs out around the world from that one event. So it's just a case of nobody knows when they will come along and how big they're going to be. And as I said, the X20 one was the largest one that was recorded by a camera, and luckily that came off the edge of the sun. So I think the last 15 years is a lot easier for us because we're monitoring the sun 24 hours a day via satellite now, so we can see these happening. Before the satellites were up there, there's very little history if they were starting to come off the edge of the sun and nobody saw them. So we didn't have any way of registering how big these are.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Great explanation.
Thanks, Kate. But presumably we still only get 8 minutes to do anything about it when we see it coming towards us anyway. So
Yeah, it's only the light. So you're only seeing the light. The light's 8 minutes. These can take anything up to, some of them are really weird, in actual fact. There was a Stargazing Live, wasn't there? One of them where they had the solar flare go off, and it was, I monitor this tomorrow. You know, it's roughly sort of 18 hours. And it came through space and put the handbrake on for 24 hours and then arrived for and not as predictable as what we think.
okay.
We've got lots of monitoring systems, but the monitoring system at the end of the day only tells us that it's gone off. Yeah, it doesn't really specify 100% how long it's going to take to get here.
Okay, understood. Excellent, thanks, Steve. So next on my list then is Paul Cotton. So Paul, I'm just going to find you on the list. There you are, and click that button, and it should ask you to unmute.
Hi. Hello.
Oh yeah,
Hi.
we can hear you.
It got
I
me.
can hear you.
Yeah, my camera's not working, I'm afraid. Gary, in Registats, what
Yeah.
does the wavelet filter on the right-hand side do? You can adjust all sorts in there by the looks of it.
You can adjust all sorts of things, but with me in general, I'm just checking I'm still online there because
You are, yeah.
yeah, it's all right. Everything just disappeared for some reason. There we go. For some, lots of things on there that you don't need to adjust, and lots of people are playing around with quite a few different things. I think these days, now that we record in SER, we don't use all of the gamma and the contrast settings that we might use with older cameras. Therefore, we would have had to play with the images a lot more in Registats. Yeah, with the wavelets or whatever your wavelets program is, AV Stacker, AVI Stacker, and like I say, I quite often use PixInsight. You can play around with these and get these as soft or as harsh as you really want.
Oh, is that what the actual filter adjustments are doing? Because there's like a whole grid.
Yeah.
I read somewhere, I don't know if it was for planetary or solar or whatever, but I think they're all set up at like 50 to start with. And it said something like you should put the center one to 500 or something.
But as you've seen by the images there, you really don't need to.
No, right.
I think, you know, you can go in and you can track the noise. So if you've accidentally kicked the gain up on one of your cameras, let's say we're using something like an IMX290 or a 178.
Yeah.
Once you get over 40% on the gain with them, then the noise attaches to the image. You can actually set slider 1. So if I share the screen quickly, that one there, and we drop that down and we go back into that image that's open. Slider 1 here, if we actually bring that up, you can use these to trap noise in the image. So the noise that's in there, you can actually get it subtracted from the image. There is an article on it that you can play around. I have used that before, but in general these days it's not running with your gain level too much. But as soon as you turn that off, it actually blocks the noise from the image, yeah, on that layer. So in a sense, it's working in reverse effect.
Yeah, I'm with you. Yeah. Okay, yeah, that's fine.
Excellent, thanks, Paul. And then we've got Steve Clifton. Steve, Tomato, there we go. Over to you.
Hi, Gary.
Hiya.
Excellent talk. My initial reaction is, and I thought DSO imaging was hard to do. there's a hell of a lot to it. All I noticed was when you were processing your final image of the sunspots on the rib structure that was seen to be bridging the two sunspots, there seemed to be one or two distinct bright spots, and I just wondered.
Yeah.
Are they an artifact or are they? So do we know?
What we don't actually know what they are.
Oh, okay.
That was what I was saying. They're very similar to an element bomb when you look at them. So at the moment, because we've not been able, I have tracked them on that particular set of sunspots, but I've not found them on anything else at the moment. So once we pick up in activity, I mean, you're probably looking at 18 months, you know, a year to 18 months before we start getting the larger sunspots come around. I've come up with lots of different ways to find this now. And working with that quantum unit, we're going to see what we can come up with. You know, it's all new stuff. So some of it that I'm trying to work on is like the magnetic connecting points around the sunspots. We've more or less got that nailed now. We just need more activity on the sun. And the sunspot we had a few weeks back, I did run over some of these processes just to see whether they're still working and I haven't forgotten anything. I'm quite bad for writing things down, so.
Okay. All right, interesting, yeah. Thanks.
No problem.
Right. Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Steve. And one in from David Banks. I'm just going to try and find you on my list. There we go.
He hasn't got a microphone. Yeah. He hasn't got a microphone.
No microphone. Okay, so so David says, why do you only use the one slider in Registrax? Several were not touched.
There's no need to use them. So it's that straightforward. So if we use slider 1, we're going to generally introduce noise. So the easiest way of thinking about this is if we look at these pieces of paper here, yeah, it's just about showing them. So if you imagine a stack of paper and you've drawn on the bottom sheet, you're trying to pull detail from the bottom sheet through. And then from sheet, say 5, however many wavelet layers you've got, yeah, is however many sheets of paper. So we're trying to bring through these fine little pieces of detail there. And what you can find is by using 3, 4, and 5, they're too harsh. So they bring it through a much harsher rate. Yeah, I think what you have to do is ask yourself, does the image look nice and are the spicules and that quite fine in detail? When you're doing more full disk images or say like quarter shots or a third shot of the sun, yeah, the idea is to try and keep that nice and fine. When you start getting in at 8 meter focal lengths on the sun, you find that the slightest little adjustment will change things dramatically. What I generally find is slider 2 just works. Yeah, that is the easiest way of putting it.
Cool. As you say, there's no need to use them. Then yeah, absolutely. Great. I think that is then all the questions. Unless I've missed anything, Grant. I don't think I've missed any.
No, there's just a few people sharing the same thoughts I had, Gary, when I saw this talk on Facebook the other week of how many things I've been doing wrong in the past, you know, like the wavelets myself. I can't wait to try just slider 2 in future because I spend so much time messing around with sliders. So there was lots of tips and tricks in there that I'm looking forward to trying myself.
Yeah, you find that it just, there is another thing to remember as well. I very much doubt whether to do it on this. We'll try this. Let me just share this 1 second and see whether it does it. Depending on the camera, Registax is a very, very old program now. And what you can do is when you're going up the initial layer, you can find that it adds like hatching in here. And you see this on some planetary, when we do planetary or lunar. And all of a sudden you get a load of hatching come across the image. It's not embedded in the image. It's just that Registax is so old now that it can't handle the processing on some of the, or the display more than the processing. So it displays some weird artifacts in it. But sometimes when you keep going up on these, yeah, so like that, if we look at that, it's just way over processed. It is, you know, you might look at it, yeah, I've got a lot more structural detail, but I prefer to bring the structural detail in via sharpening in Photoshop than I would in this. But you can find these square patterns in here. If we go back on that and go back to 3, yeah, and switch on layer 1, you can start, there's the hatch in there. You can see it there that it's brought it in. So you can see now it's actually destroying the image. Yeah. And that's what we're trying to avoid in this. So just by using that one layer, we've destroyed all of our hard work. That's really the way of looking at it. Whereas if I switch that off, there we go. So that's the key to this, is really trying to be smooth. Sometimes I might even go back to 2 on that and somewhere around there, and then actually do a little bit more sharpening in, as I say, in Photoshop. So to me, that works a lot better, and it leaves a nicer image, so that, yeah, we really, when we're looking at this, we go, wow, yeah, that's really brought out the detail. If you get too much noise and you're trying to do the 3-dimensional stuff around the filaments, it really plays havoc, yeah, with looking at the connecting structures or the structure of an object. So yeah.
Okay.
Ant's just asking, it's an interesting point, would calcium processing be very different to what you showed tonight?
Basically, yeah, I think I've got a, I think we had in the calcium folder, really calcium and white light are very similar, so I'm pretty sure that there was a video in the white light one. Yeah, there is. So if we drop that video in now, let me just drop these down. There we go. So again, we're looking at along this now for one of these that's, and this would work the same for calcium, sodium or magnesium. I'd probably use the more slightly different line on the processing. So that one there looks quite good. Everything else really there stays the same. And what we're now looking for is how many frames. So we've got 1,000 frames there, but if we've got really poor skies, or the seeing, or maybe even if our focus was slightly out, when I'm imaging on this, I probably spend about, I don't know, out of a 2-hour session, probably about 30 minutes refocusing. Yeah, I'm forever adjusting the focus to make sure that, yeah, we've not just focused it on a poor point in the seeing. So yeah, every couple of videos I'll be readjusting the focus very slightly. So you can use the same alignment points, but where I would probably change this is I would drop the amount of frames. Yeah, so now I would come in at something like 100 frames and try that. So again, you can see with the quality graph there, it's all over the place. Yeah, and that's quite typical with the white light. So if we go over to Registex now, so on here we've got the initial layer set. We might try an initial layer 3 in this, but what you've got to watch is the less frames, the softer you've got to be on the stacking. That really is the key for this, because there's no depth in the image now. So, yeah, so if you stack at, say, 400 frames, you get a lot more depth in the image. But that's perfectly recoverable. Anything that's going on in this in Photoshop. So if we try 3 there, it's a little bit harsh now. It's starting to clump everything together. So we'll go back at 2 on that, and then do all and save the image. And apply the same processes in Photoshop. Try the HDR toning. You can see here that the tilt adapter is very, very slightly off, or that we've got a problem with the scene conditions. Yeah, so we're going to have to go in there and locally sharpen that area on the image, and maybe down here. But once they're done, just save them and go. Okay, so exactly the same thing. Can crop these off, turn it into grayscale, crop.
Don't you love watching somebody who knows their way around a bit of software? It's
So there we go. Let's just take those off for a second. So that's brightened it up a little bit. And we're going to bring that back in with some gamma now. And just drop the detail back so that I do the sharpening locally. Now here you can run in with your local sharpen tool. Yeah, just be really careful on your strengths up at the top there. So, and expand the image a little bit. So we can see there's a bit of noise in there. That's the result of using only 100 frames. If you can get 200, 250 frames in there, then it half that amount of noise. So we despeckle it first, otherwise you're going to sharpen the noise. And that just destroys your detail. Yeah, and we could come in with some local sharpening in here and some local contrasting, and you'll see a sort of 14%. Yeah, that's starting to bring that back in on that side. Yeah, you can play around to your heart's content on this. Yeah, or you could just come out. Yeah, just go back to your despeckle there and go into one of your other sharpening. I mean, like you could use Astro Image, for instance, and do a multi-scale sharpen on the image. Yeah, probably these are a bit high for this one. But this would work for calcium, and it, like I say, it will work for nearly all of the others. Somewhere around there. So again, and then maybe brighten this. So just come in here and just very gently brighten this at say 10%, and that would bring the sharpening back out in that area.
Yeah.
There's lots of things that you can do to play around with the images, but that would be a general way that I would sort of run in on those.
Titch makes a comment as well. I'll just read it out, but he says, I think I might try slider 2 with my next calcium K, as some of it looks okay. Some look naff. Think it's due to messing around with too many sliders, but I think that goes back to what you were saying before, Gary. If it looks too much, bring it back down.
Yeah, it's just keep it nice and gentle and do the sharpening in a more appropriate software. Things like Photoshop handle the images a lot better now. That's the key. You got to look at, something like Registax is pretty old. Even PixInsight, you can do a lot of your processing. If you're already using that on your deep sky, use that for processing your solar or your lunar images. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just the initial stack part that you're doing auto stacker.
I see a follow-up talk coming here, Gary. A solar processing and PixInsight talk.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, PixInsight's a very, very powerful tool now. You've got so many different settings in there that you can use. And, that process of brightening and darkening the solar image, that's an old deep sky technique. That's actually used on, it was a deep sky technique from years ago for Photoshop. So I've just modified it and adapted it to use it on solar because it suits the purpose.
Fantastic.
That was excellent.
Fantastic.
Thank you very much, Gary.
Yeah. So the time, unbelievably, has just gone 9 o'clock. So I think we'll. There's no other. Oh, hang on. Okay, I think we'll pick that one up on the forum. But somebody's asked about a specific model for the Spider calibrating tool.
Yeah, I use the Spider 5 Pro. Yeah.
There we go, Ian.
The reason I used that one is because there's no limits on the amount of monitors, so I can calibrate all of my monitors. I think I seem to remember one of the older versions or the basic Spider, you can only calibrate so many monitors, and I've got computers everywhere, so.
Not just in this country, I suspect.
Yeah. So it's generally, it works quite well. They keep it up to date. And it seems to work with all of the different software.
Excellent. Good stuff. Well, in that case, then, Gary, I think we'll let you get away and have a well-deserved cup of tea or something more medicinal. And we'll say thanks very much indeed, Gary. And as Grant says, we'll definitely have you back, I think, for a bit more in-depth on the processing side. But for now, thank you, Gary. Thank you all for attending.
But just before everyone goes next week,
we're
sticking to the solar theme again for next week. We've got Colin Stewart come to give us a talk on Rebel Star, the Sun's Greatest Mysteries. I don't know if anyone's seen Colin Stewart talk before, but he's a fantastic science speaker. Lots of kind of energy and enthusiasm, and well worth a watch. So I hope to see you next week.
And of course, the link to Gary websites are on the episode topic in the forum, so do check out those as well at some point. For now, have a good week. We'll see you all very soon indeed. Thanks very much indeed, all.
Night, everybody.
Take care.
Night.
Bye.
Yeah.